Welcome to this episode of the Viking Virtual Resident Historian. It's part of our ongoing cultural enrichment program and our commitment to destination-focused learning. A series that takes you further with unique perspectives and intriguing insights. It analyzes and puts into context important chapters of world history. The Viking Virtual Resident Historian puts history at your fingertips. We hope you'll find this episode enriching.
Hello and welcome. My name is Charles Doherty. This is the second of two lectures addressing the glories of Greek civilization. The first lecture in our series is subtitled Society and Institutions. In this second lecture today, we identify the extraordinary role of the individual and his contributions across all endeavors of human creativity. And we have a subtitle, Achievements and Legacy. In recalling our well-meaning school teachers of yore who were trying to impress upon our young minds this idea that ancient Greece was the cradle of civilization. And now we have the opportunity with an adult lens to truly view and hopefully more accurately assess the validity of this memory. And this is our roadmap for navigating our story. As we appraise the importance of ancient Greece and assess this matter of whether she indeed was the cradle of civilization, we have already considered the following in part one of our lecture series. We looked at other ancient civilizations in the Mediterranean and Near Eastern regions prior to the rise and prominence of the ancient Greeks, let's say before the 6th century BC. We then began our examination of the Greek Golden Age by first considering the important components of Greek society and institutions that distinguish this period of the 5th century BC and after. These included everything from the establishment of democracy, the advanced trading networks that improved their economy, advances as well in military skills, and the building of temple designs, followed by a consideration of sport. More specifically, the important role of the Olympics in providing a sense of identity and pride among the various Greek city-states. So here is where we pick up our story, the Greek Golden Age. We'll recognize the critically important role of the individual, the artists, writers, and thinkers who now ascribe their names to a work of sculpture, a theatrical play, a mathematical theorem, or philosophical treatise. We will look at how intellectual inquiry will make significant contributions towards the betterment of society. Among the movers and shakers and thinkers in Greek society were artists and sculptors and architects, as well as mathematicians, scientists, and philosophers. They evolved and learned from each other across all disciplines as they attempted to solve problems and make a better society. But their critical thinking goes beyond just making improvements. Ancient Greeks were also probing the nature of the cosmos and the universe. They were asking significant questions as to how the world functioned. Their profound curiosity about the natural world included an analysis of life forms and human anatomy. This far exceeded anything recorded among other ancient civilizations thus far. Now, for the first time, we have actual names of individuals who associated themselves proudly with the nature and results of their life work. And it is no accident that many of their names will be familiar, almost household words to us, so many years and decades following our school teachers' recitations about how and why the Greeks matter. In addressing the rise of the individual, we will now consider some of the extraordinary contributions of the ancient Greeks within 7 distinct fields of inquiry. Let's start with philosophy. Greek culture had been dominated by mythology. Gods and goddesses had traditionally helped explain natural phenomena like the weather and seasons. But Greek philosophers eventually came to believe that history was no longer a game of the gods. By the 6th century BC, Greek thinkers were beginning to challenge mythological assumptions. They were tackling such vexing questions as how the world really functioned and why. Unrestrained by religious orthodoxy or dogma, philosophers began to pursue an alternate view of the universe, and a group of thinkers known as the Sophists, or teachers of wisdom, came together under the discipline of philosophy. They embraced the study of all knowledge, including biology, mathematics, astronomy, and geography. Early Greek philosophers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle were pioneers in opening minds to the universal question, how does mankind function within the greater cosmos? And other questions, such as, what is the proper moral and ethical conduct of the individual? Or, similarly, how should man behave? Similarly, how can we create an ideal political system? Although he never wrote down his ideas, the teachings of Socrates were recorded by his students. He focused on the moral responsibility of the individual. He believed that good behavior was possible through education and understanding. But he became increasingly unpopular and finally fell afoul of the authorities. He was charged with disobeying religious law, specifically that of corrupting the youth of Athens, and was forced to commit suicide via the poison hemlock. Socrates' student, Plato, was shaken by his teacher's unjust death. He continued his mentor's thinking and sought an ideal way of governing a state. He set out his detailed ethics-based rules for making it work in Politeia and the Republic, and went on to found his academy in Athens around 385 BC. This was the first such institution of higher learning in the Western world. A pupil of Plato's was Aristotle. He was a polymath, tackling a wide range of topics within the fields of politics and the sciences. Just as Plato had done, he also looked for the ideal means of running a city-state. His most important contribution is arguably the concept of observing nature, recording tiny nuances within a subject. This empirical method became the starting point for intellectual inquiry within the history of ideas. The word mathematics derives from the ancient Greek word mathema, meaning a subject of instruction. Its actual origins and history within Greek culture are vague. No mathematical documents from the Greek bronze cultures of the Mycenaeans or Minoans have survived. But it is thought that some early mathematical knowledge may have originated in the neighboring civilizations of Babylonia and Egypt. Three key figures in Greek mathematics in particular made great advances in both mathematics and number theory. The first of these is Pythagoras of Samos. Little is known about his personal life. Most details were recorded centuries after his time. We do know, however, that he established a group of followers called the Pythagoreans. They lived and worked communally, owning and sharing property and knowledge. While much of the group's knowledge was credited to Pythagoras, in reality, many of the advances, including his famous theorem, were probably the result of communal work of his group. We also don't know very much about the life of Euclid of Alexandria, not even the years of his birth and death. He is referred to as the father of geometry, and it is he who deduced the first principles of what was known as geometry, principles that have remained in place for 2,000 years. His seminal book, Elements, is a canon of mathematics, exploring both geometry and number theory. It is one of the most influential works in the history of mathematics, and was used as a textbook until the early 20th century. Finally, Archimedes of Syracuse was a mathematician, engineer, inventor, and astronomer. His work anticipated modern calculus. Among his mathematic accomplishments were calculating the area of a circle, the surface area and volume of a sphere, and the area under a parabola. He also derived an accurate approximation for pi. You remember, the ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter. Killed by a Roman soldier during the siege of Syracuse, Archimedes had requested that his tomb be decorated with a sculpture of a sphere and a cylinder. He had accurately calculated this relationship of their volumes before he died. Let's turn to the role of medicine and we will start with the myth of Aesculapius and then move to the realities of Hippocrates, who is considered to be the father of modern medicine. Before Hippocrates, the study of medicine had been incorporated within the discipline of philosophy. Ancient Greeks believed that a medical problem was a divine punishment or an act of God, and that the only means of a cure was an intervention from the gods. Aesculapius, seen here in the center of the screen, was just such a god. He was the god of healing and venerated by followers who would come from all over to visit, and more importantly, to sleep in special dreaming rooms in his healing temples. After dreaming of their ailment, patients would recount their dream to a priest. They would then receive a cure based on the priest's interpretation of their dream. Snakes were an essential part of this healing process. Those same snakes are the ones that we see today on the staff of Aesculapius, a universal sign for medicine seen here on the left. Hippocrates, seen here on the right, turned his back on all this magic. From his school of medicine in Kos, he separated medicine from religion, teaching that all disease is natural. With his students, he wrote the Hippocratic Corpus, a collection of some 60 medical texts in which they make not one single reference to a mystical or supernatural cause or cure of illness. His Hippocratic oath is often paraphrased as "do no harm," and it remains today a seminal code of medical conduct. Among the adages of Hippocrates is this advice: walking is man's best medicine. Some 2,500 years may have passed, but this is still dispensed in medical practitioners' offices today. Finally, let us look at Greek poets, writers, and dramatists. The Greeks loved a good story. They saw storytelling as a way to understand their world. In the Bronze Age, they relied on an oral tradition to perpetuate these stories. This changed, however, with Homer's epic poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey. We don't know that much about him, including exactly when and where he lived. But some scholars even doubt that he was one person, suggesting his work was the product of a group of poets. What we do know is that he brought to life and undoubtedly embellished these oral traditions in his poems about events during and after the Trojan War. They introduce us to heroes, to battles, and to love stories, and they engage us in the great themes of the journeys of war and the journeys of love and despair. Following Homer, most of Greek literary output survives as drama, divided into two principal genres, tragedy and comedy. Tragedy focused on great questions about the human condition, questions that remain just as relevant to audiences today as they were to the ancient Greeks. The three master playwrights of tragedy were Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. First, Aeschylus, regarded as the founder of Greek tragedy, developed the concept of dialogue and introduced more than one performing actor to the stage. After him came Sophocles, further advancing plot development and writing his narrative from the perspective of human characters. He was also the first to introduce stage sets and design. Finally, there is Euripides, whose Medea introduces themes of love, betrayal, and revenge. Turning to comedy, we find characters that are more likely to be drawn from everyday life. Its dialogue often brings to life burning political questions of the day, or perhaps foibles of local celebrities. The humor in such comedies is often of a rude or bawdy nature, and among the most famous of the comedy playwrights is Aristophanes. It is a testament to his skill that humor in his most famous work, Lysistrata, still elicits laughs from an audience today. Along with the temple, the outdoor theater is one of ancient Greece's crowning architectural achievements. The theater at Epidaurus, shown here in the lower right, was begun by the Greeks in the 4th century BC, and it was later expanded during the Roman period to accommodate some 14,000 theatergoers. Many other Greek theaters could hold even up to 20,000. There were special stone seats at the front, available for dignitaries, foreign visitors, or competition judges. However, the majority of the theatergoers sat upon the rows of stone benches. During Periclean times, the Athenian state provided free theater tickets and seats for the poor. Greeks loved sculpture and used statuary and relief carvings for a variety of purposes. Sculpture decorated temples and people's homes. Although much of the Greek sculptural record has been lost to us, some objects have been found in modern times as grave markers, others at excavation or shipwreck sites. Others are known to us through later copies made by the Romans. Generally, sculpture was cast in bronze or carved from limestone or marble. Much of that bronze statuary was later melted down for armaments during times of war, but sandstone or marble versions have survived. And there are two things that surprise many modern viewers about Greek sculpture. First is the realization that Greek sculpture would have been richly painted, as traces of paint survive on some figures. And second is that sometimes glass or colored stones were inserted in the eye orbitals. Each of these colorful additions are in stark contrast to our view of monochromatic, creamy white marble figures today. And in this context, we need to consider the contributions of two noted Greek sculptors. Phidias of the 5th century, who is represented by the examples on the left of the screen, and Praxiteles of the following 4th century BC, whose standing male is on the right. In our discussion of the Olympics, I mentioned the colossal statue of Zeus, housed in the temple there dedicated to him. Destroyed in the 5th century AD, the statue's depiction only survives on ancient coins. And what you see on the screen is a later artist's imagined view from a 16th century engraving. This seated gold and ivory statue, astoundingly 43 feet tall, was so important and so widely documented in Greek literature that it was revered as one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world. Other examples of Phidias's surviving work, however, are seen within the east pediment of the Parthenon, shown in the upper left. This is part of the Elgin marbles residing in the British Museum in London. Here, Phidias has mastered the compositional challenge of relating stories of the gods, but he combines both drama and realism to fit into the severe configuration of an isosceles triangle. The grace, elegance, and natural portrayals of the human form are brought together in an impossibly constraining triangular frame, yet this tight format doesn't appear to interfere with the storytelling. Praxiteles carved the Hermes and infant Dionysus shown here on the right. Note the epitome of the ideal classical male form in what's known as contrapposto, which means one leg engaged, one leg relaxed, and it gives an added air of naturalism and believability. During the classical period, Greek gods become more human. Meanwhile, portrayals of humans become more godlike. Praxiteles, by the way, will also be remembered for creating the first freestanding female nude in the history of art. As in the world of architecture, mathematical ratios will be key in the ideal portrayal of the human form. Over the course of the classical era, ideal proportions for a standing male figure will begin with a ratio of approximately 6 heads tall times the height of the human frame. Some 100 to 150 years later, this ideal proportion will be elongated. This creates an elegant attenuation with the body stretched to 7 or 8 heads tall. In essence, this evolution strives to attain ideal beauty through an understanding of mathematics. And we come back to this. Why is this important? Like all pursuits of the ideal, this continual striving for perfection in sculpture and this attention to detail is applied to all forms of human endeavor and inquiry. As I mentioned earlier, the body of ancient Greek painting has been lost to us as painted surfaces on ephemeral materials or wall surfaces were ravaged by natural disasters, such as floods, mudslides, and earthquakes. Very few have survived. Appearing as architectural decoration on both temples and houses, such frescoed surfaces would have begun during the Archaic period as rather flat, somewhat two-dimensional images. During the Classical era, however, a more realistic depiction emerges, leading the Greeks to become pioneers in using an early form of perspective, a depiction of foreground, middle ground, and background in their painted compositions. By the Hellenistic period, wealthy homes would have been rich in frescoed murals and other such paintings hanging on their walls. However, our consideration of Greek genius in painting emerges here in consideration of the Euphroneous crater, the vase that appears on your screen. So important, it was known and referred to by the name of this significant master of Greek vase painting, Euphronius. Although most of Greek pottery was intended to be functional, essentially for everyday use, its painted decoration evolved over time to include a more accurate depiction of the human form. Moreover, many scenes of everyday life and customs depict valuable representations of costumes and clothing, scenes of slavery, let alone weapons and armor, and those of Olympic events we've mentioned. Sometimes the images on the vases are the only surviving documents, many unrecorded in literary or written form. The decorative pot shown here is in the form of a crater, a large vase in which wine would be mixed with water. And often such vases were made by two people, one who molded or turned the clay to make the form, and another who painted the decorative subject matter. Later on, vases might be signed on the bottom by both potter and painter. As we've traced the evolution of Greek temple and sculptural design, we too could have traced the similar progression in vase painting. Many of the archaic vases will appear in what's termed black figureware, a style popular in the mid-7th century BC. However, the Euphroneous vase shown here, dating to around 515 BC, is of the red figure style. In this alternate decorative style, figures remain in the color of the red terracotta clay, and surrounding them appear the black outlines applied in the form of a black glaze. This early and commanding example of red figure technique is a vase depicting two scenes. On one side, an episode from the Trojan War, depicted on the screen, while on the other side of the crater appears a depiction of the Athenian youth arming themselves for battle. We should ask ourselves the following questions. First, how might this vase come to represent the rise of the individual and the role of Euphroneus as master painter? Second, how might we place the vase and the artist into some form of context? And lastly, just why is this vase so important, considered among the finest of all Greek vases of the ancient world? First, it's the only one of some 27 surviving portions of his pottery that is virtually complete. And recall, it is more than 2,500 years old. Second, it is an early and commanding example of red figure technique vase painting. But more significantly, the vase is signed by both the painter Euphroneus as well as the potter. Thus, it is probably the earliest known work of art with an artist's name in the entire history of art. Within the sphere of Greek humanism, the role of the individual was to advance to new levels of accomplishment within such a diversity of fields. Now the artist's personal accomplishments reach a new height. Art isn't produced just for religious purposes or royal patronage. Documentation of an artist's name, an early form of signature, provides validation of his artistic achievements, which for millennia previously had been produced anonymously. Euphroneus is essentially saying, this is of me, this is by me, this is of my hand, and I'm darn proud of it. In the study of history and the search for primary sources for documentation, historians researching cultures prior to the ancient Greeks have encountered a variety of difficulties. Before the Greeks, the earliest annals of proto-history were compiled haphazardly, often drawn from a king's list or other court documents that were fragmentary at best. Two men will change all that. Herodotus, shown left, often referred to as the father of history, and later Thucydides, shown center, who is sometimes referred to as the father of scientific history. First, Herodotus. He's the first in the ancient world to conduct proper historiography, the study of written history, as opposed to promoting oral history or the oral tradition. His work, titled Histories, was written between the mid to late 5th century BC, or contemporaneous with the building of the Parthenon. A page from this work appears in the upper right, and it offers details of leaders and political issues spanning some 100 years before his time. He discusses, for example, key 6th century BC non-Greek historical figures, such as Darius I of Persia. Moreover, he was among the first to compare historical facts, recognizing a linkage or sequence of events akin to a timeline of history. Note the map in the lower right of the screen, which portrays the known world surrounding the Greeks during the time of Herodotus. It's shown in a mustard color. What's so amazing is what was not known during his lifetime. Yet, in his volume, History Book 1, he manages to foresee, in a most insightful manner, the concept of the rise and fall of empires. And from here, I go to a quotation for you, in which Herodotus states, "I shall go forward with my history, describing equally the greater and lesser cities. For the cities which were formerly great have most of them become insignificant, and such are at present powerful were weak. I shall therefore discourse equally on both, convinced that human happiness never continues long in one stay." An inveterate traveler, he would visit Egypt, as well as the Black Sea and Babylon, conducting research far from Athens. He would interview people and examine documents from other cultures. Thucydides lived later in the century and is often referred to as the father of scientific history. His major work, The History of the Peloponnesian War, is considered one of the first history books written in the late 5th century BC. He has this reputation of scientific investigation because he placed great emphasis on the gathering of evidence through eyewitness accounts. He was known for his early use of cause and effect analysis of the historical facts he gathered. Such was the careful scrutiny of evidence and thoughtful analysis that would underpin so many of the great accomplishments of the ancient Greeks. This lecture has demonstrated how the Greeks managed to create an extraordinary society, different from other ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern civilizations. We've also highlighted the critical role of individuals who made significant contributions beyond their fields, bettering society for future generations. Let's now look at the legacy of the ancient Greeks and consider how they made a difference for those cultures and societies that followed. Their imprint upon the arts and architecture and rules of governance across the ages is clearly evident in the history of their conquerors, the Romans, and of the others who followed them centuries later in Europe, North America, and beyond. Rome could never have existed nor thrived as an empire without the Greeks. Many of the early Greek achievements in science and mathematics allowed the Romans to further advance their engineering techniques and skills. We see the result in the creation of tremendous civic structures and roads that allowed for maintenance of their vast empire. Although the basics of concrete were known earlier in the Middle East, it was the Greeks who perfected its formulation through the addition of lime around the year 600 BC. It was the Romans who will first exploit its use in constructing vast civic structures like the Colosseum or the Baths of Caracalla. Such colossal structures, apart from the earlier Egyptian pyramids of cut stone, were largely unknown in the ancient Mediterranean. In addition to structural advances, The Romans furthered Greek architectural design as well. The Pantheon, shown left, borrows directly from a Greek temple design, with its columns across the front surmounted by the triangular pediment. But now the Romans will add a dome. And whereas the Greeks primarily used the Doric and Ionic orders to ornament their capitals atop the columns, the Romans will borrow these along with their own expanded examples of the Greek Corinthian order, used here on the Pantheon. On the Colosseum, the Romans will appropriate and use all three Greek orders. The agora and the early forms of democracy were also fundamental to the later evolution of the Roman Forum and other civic institutions prior to the imperial era. Similarly, Greek influence is apparent across all the arts. Now, the Romans will apply their humans-looking godlike approach for representations of their emperors, now godlike personifications of power and influence. Note, for example, the statue of Augustus of Prima Porta, shown in the center of the screen. The emperor is portrayed in the guise of a Greek god whose breastplate and armor makes allusions to Mars, the god of war, while celebrating the Augustan territorial and military conquests. Because of the acquisitive nature of the Romans, we know a lot about ancient Greek sculpture. Recall the Romans loved to copy the sculpture of the Greeks, and many of these Greek bronzes only survive in Roman marble copies. Similarly, we know something of the now lost art of Greek painting because of the Roman murals. Notice the example on the right, a portion of a wall painting found at Pompeii. Greek interiors, especially homes of the wealthy during the Hellenistic era, were decorated with elaborate murals and frescoes. Many painters in later Greek periods employed spatial relationships and perspective. Note this Roman example from Pompeii, a portrayal of the three Graces, who twist and turn with cast shadows across their anatomy to give the impression of round, corporeal beings in a natural and relaxed pose within a believable space. The Romans inform us of their knowledge of Greek painting and their accurate depiction of figures in space, using both mathematical precision and attention to detail. Such skills that survive in Greek pottery were undoubtedly a part of Greek painting as well. Thank goodness the Romans were such skilled imitators, if not lovers, of all things Greek. The Greek literary footprint, so evident in Roman sculpture and painting, is also seen throughout much of Roman writing. The Greek writings of Herodotus and Thucydides were known and read by the Romans. Roman writers would follow their tradition of evidence gathering for writing their own histories. Julius Caesar, shown upper left, was not only a great military commander, but also an extensive writer of history. Although born in Rome, he was educated on the Greek island of Rhodes. The 7-volume The Gallic Wars is seen in the image on the upper center of the screen. It devotes 1 volume per year to the recording of his military campaigns in Gaul and southern England during the mid-1st century BC. His exhaustive military documentation follows on that of Thucydides and the devotion to accurate transcriptions of the Peloponnesian War some 400 years earlier. Another later Roman biographer and essayist, Plutarch, shown in the lower left, would write in Greek, but his intended readership was in both the Greek and Roman worlds. His Plutarch's Lives, shown lower center, is a series of biographies of famous Greeks and Romans, pairing 23 Greek and Roman lives, so that the reader can recognize and compare their careers, shared moral virtues, and vices. The legacy of Greek mythology is similarly of great influence upon Roman writers. The pantheon of Roman gods and goddesses embraces many of the same attributes of their ancient Greek forebears. However, their actual names and attributes may have slight variations. Here we see Diana on the right of your screen, the Roman goddess of the hunt, the moon, and nature. Her Greek name is Demeter, and known more often in Greece as the goddess of the harvest. She is often depicted with wild animals, shown here with a deer with whom she could communicate. The sculpture, sometimes called Diana of Versailles, is a Roman marble copy of a lost Greek bronze, originally done 400 or 500 years earlier. The associations and underlying indebtedness of the Romans to the Greeks are unquestioned, particularly when we consider how intertwined their worlds evolved over the centuries. The spread of Christianity across Western Europe during the medieval period barely diminished the humanist interest in classical antiquity among artists, writers, and poets. Particularly during the Italian High Renaissance of the late 15th and early 16th centuries, artists like Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and Raphael were as comfortable retelling pagan stories of Greek myths and legends as portraying biblical stories from both the Old and New Testaments. The humanism underlying much of their writing informed and aided the Renaissance artists in depicting a more human-centered society. Two examples from the early 16th century, shown here, best demonstrate the influence of classical Greece. Michelangelo's David in sculpture on the left, and Raphael's School of Athens in fresco painting on the right. Michelangelo advances the Greek achievements in portraying the human form by taking the myth of David and Goliath to a heightened emotional plane. Now the psychological moment just prior to David's hurling the stone at Goliath is recorded on a grand scale. David stands some 17 feet tall. Similarly, Raphael, commissioned by Pope Julius II to paint 4 frescoes on the walls of the Vatican's papal apartments. He returns to the humanist ideals of the ancient Greek academy. His School of Athens, although portrayed under a grandiose, more Roman-like vaulted interior under this soaring archway, celebrates the best and the brightest of the learned Greek academy. Here Plato and Aristotle, centermost, are accompanied by Socrates, Pythagoras, Euclid, and Ptolemy, among others, on the steps below, all notable academicians in their fields. In each instance, the rich visual, literary, and academic traditions of the Greek world provide inspiration for the learned men of the Italian Renaissance, seeking anchorage in humanistic thought some 1,500 years after the Hellenistic era. We cannot omit the legacy of the ancient Greek language, present throughout the modern era. Let's first turn to its application in the early 19th century and its role in deciphering Egyptian hieroglyphics. The meaning behind these ancient Egyptian pictographs, and by extension the background for understanding much of Egyptian art and culture, was lost upon generations of early explorers and archaeologists. That is, until the discovery and translation of what is commonly referred to as the Rosetta Stone. The large, inscribed black stele was so named because it was found in Rosetta, a city some 35 miles northeast of Alexandria, and discovered by a French expeditionary soldier in the year 1799. With the British defeat of the French forces there in 1801, it was surrendered by the French to the British and has been housed continuously in the British Museum since 1802. Measuring almost 4 feet high and some 2.5 feet wide, it bears the inscription of a decree issued on behalf of King Ptolemy V in Memphis in the year 196 BC. It explains this decree in 3 different scripts: ancient hieroglyphics in the upper register, Demotic script, a later form of ancient Egyptian script for document writing, in the middle register, and ancient Greek in the lower register. Although the ancient Greek was the first to be translated in 1803, it wasn't until some 19 years later in 1822 that another Frenchman, Jean-François Champollion, announced his success in the full transliteration of the hieroglyphic pictographs. Now, part of the complexity of the task was realizing how the 3 different scripts are written, but as well how they're read. For example, Demotic in the Middle Register is written in red from the right to the left, and ancient hieroglyphics in the Upper Register could be written in a variety of ways, top to bottom, left to right, or right to left. This is why the challenge of unlocking the puzzle and its transliteration defied so many for nearly 2 decades. In the end, the more widely understood ancient Greek in the Lower Register allowed scholars the gateway for deciphering the enigmatic hieroglyphs and thereby allowing entree into the mysteries of ancient Egyptian culture and society. Lastly, we see remnants of the ancient Greek language in evidence in a variety of ways across all cultures. First, characters of the Greek alphabet, from alpha to omega, are referred to in literature. They were also used in business for branding, for example, omega watches, as well as mathematical and scientific notation, the use of the word beta or the infinity symbol. Moreover, the actual word alphabet in the English language is derived from the first 2 letters of the Greek alphabet, alpha and beta. Also consider the Greek letters used for American fraternities and sororities, where through the appropriation of letters of the Greek alphabet, those social clubs on college and university campuses acquire prestige and what they perceive will be sophistication through their association with ancient Greek culture. Another means of recognizing the role of Greek culture in more modern times comes with the appreciation of the art and design movement known as neoclassicism. Referring to this revived interest in the principles, aesthetics, and rational order of the Greco-Roman world, particularly in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, it appealed to audiences, especially in France and the United States. Especially here, the French and Americans sought to anchor their newly earned freedoms and democratic principles, enshrined in the Declaration of Independence and U.S. Constitution. In the Greek context, where democracy began, enlightened thinkers had worked together in academies of higher learning within elegantly designed and proportioned buildings. The foundations of order and rationality, so espoused after the revolutions of the 1780s and 90s, were now symbolically evoked, not only philosophically as institutions in governing society, but also during this important aesthetic movement. From the mid-18th century onwards, the movement will become the definitive style of painting, literature, theater, and music, as well as fashion and the decorative arts. However, its classical aesthetics will have the longest currency within the field of architecture, where its continuous waxing and waning is in evidence even into the 21st century. Its designs offered a more sober aesthetics, seen as a healthy respite from the preceding artistic periods of the Baroque and the Rococo. The neoclassical infused world offered the opposite, visual respites from the Baroque drama. Let's turn to one of the seminal representations of classicism in painting. Shown here on the screen is The Death of Socrates, a work of 1787 by the French painter Jacques-Louis David. It's among the masterpieces housed today in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. The narrative concerns the elder Socrates having been convicted of corrupting the youth of Athens through the introduction of uncommon gods. In the painting, David portrays the heroic philosopher as an old man, attended by others in this cavernous, almost prison-like dungeon. Although David employs some elements of Baroque painting, the dramatic lighting, and asymmetrical composition, he nevertheless evokes the neoclassical mood of balance, harmony, and reserve underlying Plato's classical text. According to Plato, quote, "On his last day, he appeared both happy in manner and words, as he died nobly and without fear." The heroism and stoicism posed by the old rational philosopher on his deathbed is counterbalanced by the emotional young attendant wearing the orange toga in the foreground. He offers the chalice with hemlock in one hand while using the other to shield his face, seemingly gripped in a silent form of remorse over his role as an unwilling accomplice in the death of this towering figure of Greek philosophy. As mentioned, the influence of neoclassicism is most in evidence in European and North American architecture. The basic components of the Greek temple design were readily borrowed by architects of the 18th and 19th centuries as they turned to Greek design idioms as symbols of strong civic governance overseen by noble patrician landowners. Greece, after all, had become known as the cradle of civilization, and by association, her aesthetics were incorporated into the American idiom as emblematic of the new federal and republican ideals following independence. Moreover, there was a stylistic period within American architecture and design in the mid-19th century actually called the Greek Revival style. This popular design idiom incorporated Greek components not only within both civic and vernacular structures, but also for furnishing American interiors, including designs for furniture, upholstery, mirrors, candlesticks, among other many decorative objects. Turning to the three examples on the screen, many of these easily recognizable to many of you. On the left, the U.S. Capitol, in the center, the U.S. Supreme Court, and on the right, the Parthenon. No, not that one. The one in Nashville, Tennessee. We could identify many Greek design elements appearing within these three examples. For example, skillful proportions, usually of a symmetric design, a porch or steps, creating a pedestal-like appearance, columns with capitals, the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian orders, friezes and pediments, usually with sculptural relief, and sometimes a portico or colonnade across the front and often surrounding the sides. One can readily see these components in the U.S. Capitol, whose dome, however, owes a bit more to ancient Rome than Athens, and certainly in the design for the U.S. Supreme Court. However, one of the most striking legacies of Greek architecture appears on the far right. This recreation of a full-scale replica of the Parthenon was built in Nashville, the city priding itself as the Athens of the South. Built in commemoration of the Tennessee Centennial Exhibition of 1897, it included reproductions of the Athenian sculptural program as well. In considering this legacy, the ancient Greek architects would be so proud. Their quest for order, balance, and symmetry through application of mathematical formulae to perfect architectural design and becoming standard practice some 2,000 years later on the other side of the world in lands unknown to them. Wow, how extraordinary. The modern Olympic Games, held every 2 years and watched by over 1 billion television viewers worldwide, are perhaps the most compelling legacy of all Greek history and culture. Prior to the modern games as we know them, loosely organized athletic events took place in various parts of Europe dating back to the 17th century. But it was during the 1860s that the games became more advanced, amateur in nature, but international in outlook. Actual games were held in Greece, once more in Olympia in 1870, when some 30,000 spectators attended, and again in 1875. However, our modern Olympic Games arose from meetings held in June of 1894. This marked the formation of the International Olympic Committee, the IOC, and the first modern Olympiad opened 2 years later in the Pan-Athenaic Stadium in Athens. Among the 1896 participants were athletes from 14 nations. Winners received a silver medal along with an olive branch, harking back to those ancient games. Second-place finishers were awarded a copper one with a laurel branch. Some 10 of the 14 competing nations won medals. Greece, the host nation, won the most with 46. The second Olympics were held in Paris in association with the Paris Exhibition of 1900. Although no formal stadium existed for these games, It was here in Paris in 1900 that women competed for the first time. In 1924, the first winter week of Olympic competition began in Chamonix, in France. The Paralympics had their beginnings following the rehabilitation of Second World War soldiers. Beginning in 1948, these athletes competed as a portion of the Olympics held in London that year. Since 1988, the Seoul Olympics, each host country of the Summer Games, also hosts the Paralympic ones. Today, the Summer Games attract more than 10,000 athletes from more than 200 countries. The Winter Games, however, are a smaller event, attracting around 1/3 as many athletes from just under 1/3 the number of countries. The 5 colors of the Olympic flag, at least one of these colors appears in every flag of every nation, were adopted in 1914. But the flag wasn't flown officially for the first time until the 1920 Antwerp Games. Lastly, at the first modern Olympics of 1896, there were only silver and copper medals. The awarding of the 3 gold, silver, bronze medals as we know them began at the 1904 St. Louis Olympics. So, in considering the true legacy of Greek civilization, we must return to our central question: why is ancient Greece so important? But we might also address a second question as well. As we recall our school teachers of yore, was ancient Greece really the cradle of civilization? Regarding the importance of ancient Greece, between the 8th and 5th centuries BC, the Greeks would master the ability to create institutions of governance and trading mechanisms for buying and selling goods with other city-states and neighbors further away. They would build a foundation for a just and organized society that would be envied and improved upon by others for centuries later. At the center of this human-oriented society was the belief that man was capable of learning across all disciplines. Man was morally and ethically responsible for making changes and continually striving to improve society, leading to the rise of individual accomplishments. Now, so proud of his achievements, the individual ascribes his name to a theorem, a sculpture, a painted vase, or a work of drama for the stage. Greek achievements in architecture, sculpture, painting, literature, and drama, not to mention across all branches of science, mathematics, and philosophy, demonstrate this robust thirst for intellectual inquiry and the rise of the Athens Academy to further promote the advancement of knowledge. Learning is now an esteemed endeavor, and the career of teacher and critical thinker a vaunted profession. Greek ideals of higher learning will inform young Romans, eager to advance in society and allowing them to master new feats of engineering, building structures much larger and more grand than anything the Greeks built, and greatly expanding their own imperial and societal boundaries for centuries after. Moreover, the Greek model for learning will become the model for European universities from the Middle Ages onwards. So all of these factors unquestionably contributed to the advances in Western societies over the centuries that followed. But now, the second question. Was ancient Greece really the cradle of civilization? This is rather an extravagant phrase as we now recognize advances in ancient China and other parts of the world during those centuries prior to enduring the time of the ancient Greeks. So let's paraphrase our school teacher's phrase perhaps another way. Yes, ancient Greece was one of the cradles of civilization. But in the end, Western societies owe so much to the Greek world, and by extension to their Roman imitators, who perpetuated the ideals of Greek art, architecture, culture, and society. Without their eager appropriation for all things Greek, European and later North American societies would neither have evolved nor look the same as they do today. Thank you very much.